So now it's 4:35. We will start straight away. I'm sure there will be more people joining us because there were more than 40 sign up. So this afternoon, we are very honored to have Professor Anthony Milner with us. I'm sure many of you have heard of him, and also his probably heard about his famous book, The Kerajaan. I think in the flyer you already have his biodata, very brief one. So he is now currently a visiting professor at the Asia Europe Institute at University of Malaya, and also Professorial fellow at the Asia Institute at the University of Melbourne. And he was formerly for a long time associated with Australian National University as Basham Professor of Asian History. Without much ado, today he is going to share his thoughts with us on Islamization in the Malay world, timing, process, and impact. So I give the floor to you.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you for that introduction. Well, why did Islam take hold in the Malay world when it did, starting in the late 1200s? The question raises issues about how the new religion spread and also the initial impact it had on the societies of this region. As the Dutch scholar Van Brussen has noted, foreign Muslims had probably been resident in the trading ports of Sumatra and Java for many centuries, but it was only toward the end of the 13th century that we find traces of apparently indigenous Muslims. So why is this the case? And Brunson says that any theory of Islamization in the Malay archipelago must answer this question. Some years ago, Farid Alatas asked the same question about timing, and more recently, Jeff Wade asked the question again in the new Cambridge History of Islam. He admitted the issue remains an enigma. The matter of timing, it seems to me, has not got the attention it deserves. There's been more focus over the years on just where Islamic influences came from, Arabia, some region of India, and so forth. The question of timing deserves more attention, partly because of the light it throws on other aspects of Islamization in Southeast Asia. My own particular interest in this topic is encouraged by my preoccupation with the history of ideas. It can be argued that the contest of ideas, the development of ideas, remains a neglected field in Malay studies. Well, there's certainly strong evidence, including archaeological evidence, of Muslims being active in Southeast Asia long before the 13th century. Arabs traveled through the archipelago to China. Envoys sent from Southeast Asian countries to China sometimes had Muslim names. Barus in North Sumatra was renowned among Arabs for its camphor, at least since the 8th century. And in the early 10th century, a Persian writer noticed a report that in the Sumatran kingdom of Srivijaya, the parrots talked Arabic and Parsi as well as Chinese. In recent times, Jeff Wade, who has worked closely with Chinese sources, has concluded that we can say with some certainty that Muslim merchants were well ensconced in Southeast Asia by the early 10th century. Now, aware of such research conclusions, those scholars who've tried to decide why it was only in the 13th century that local Islamic polities emerged in the archipelago have considered a number of factors. Several historians have suggested that the coming of Christianity stimulated Islamization, and there does seem to be evidence in more recent times of Christian missionaries provoking ulama to revitalize their teaching and their authority. But Christianity arrived in the region too late to have an influence in the 14th and the 15th centuries. It's also not clear that Muslim leaders in Southeast Asia were always antagonistic to the Christian states coming into the region. Some of the Portuguese documents, which are published in recent times by the Malaysian National Archives, make clear that members of the Malay royal elites reached out to the Portuguese, trying to establish friendly relations with them. Another development, which is sometimes seen to have benefited Islamization in Southeast Asia, was the decline in the 13th century of the South Indian Hindu Chola dynasty. It had possessed influence in the archipelago, including through Tamil guilds and military raids, and its decline could have assisted other networks, including Muslim networks, to compete for attention in Southeast Asia. One more factor that may have helped to promote Islamization was a change in China's trade policy. In the 12th and 13th centuries, as described by Oliver Walters, Southern Sung policies led to an expansion of Chinese mercantile activity. Large numbers of Chinese ships went out to the archipelago, trading in one small port after another, offering opportunities for these smaller states to operate separately from such large centres as Palembang. Centres, that is, for major tributary states, which had controlled the archipelago trade to China. When Chinese ships came from China, bypassing the tributary framework, they engaged directly with smaller states, promoting their growth and promoting the competition between such states. These small polities would have sought trade from every direction. So the question is whether they may have seen the adoption of Islam as helpful in this competitive context. Now, I'll return to the matter of how important the Islamic component of 13th and 14th century trade may have been. But one well-established theme in writing on Islamization has been the link between trade and the conversion process. The Dutch scholar, Drewes, for instance, states that it is an uncontestable fact that the Muslim trader is the most common missionary of Islam in foreign parts. Drewes wrote too of traders and dealers coming to the archipelago, marrying women native to the region and gradually becoming related to prominent families of the land. Islamization, so this conveys, was a bottom-up process, beginning with the traders and gradually influencing the state elites. One problem with this stress on the merchants as driving Islamization is that, as we've noted, trade with Muslim merchants had been going on for centuries. Some researchers have suggested there was an increase in Muslim trade in the period of Islamization, and this may well be significant. Muhammad Redwan Othman, writing from the University of Malaya, as one of those arguing that such an expansion of Muslim trade took place. Arab merchants, he said, found that many of the commodities that were demanded by China, India, the Arab world, and Europe could be found in Southeast Asia. Another scholar, Michael Pearson, has concluded that by the 12th century, the trade east from India was increasingly controlled by Indian Muslims. Jeff Wade has argued that in addition to these trade developments, there was an influx of Muslims from China in the 14th century, Muslims of Persian and Arab backgrounds, as well as Chinese, fleeing violent conflict in China. The evidence is growing, therefore, of an expansion of the Muslim presence in Southeast Asia at the time we know the Islamization of local communities was underway. The mere expansion of the numbers of Muslims, however, can't in itself be seen as sufficient to bring about Islamization. In this respect, Wade cites the example of a number of Javanese states where Muslims were known to have been present over a considerable time, and yet the local people in these states didn't adopt the religion of the foreign settlers. One specific development that does appear to be relevant to the timing of Islamic conversion in Southeast Asia is the expansion of Sufism, Islamic mysticism, in the broader Islamic world. My colleague at the ANU, Anthony Johns, has been prominent among those drawing attention to this development. The Sufi movement, Johns has said, was in fact almost identical with the Islamic world during a period of 500 years from the 13th to the 18th centuries. Note, the starting point here is the 13th century. In Johns's view, Islam could not and did not put down roots among the people of the Indonesian states or win their rulers until it was preached by the Sufis, the wandering dervishes. The approach to Islam of the Sufis, says Johns, was in tune with existing religious attitudes in the region. In Southeast Asia, the Sufis faced the Shiva Buddha mystics on equal terms as mystic to mystic. The Sufis represented a type of teacher and taught a pattern of doctrine with which the Indonesians were familiar, he says. The Sufis, Johns argues, were the primary impulse and the active element in the spread of Islam in Southeast Asia. That is, the expansion of Islam was externally, not internally driven. Also, it was, in Johns's view, a bottom-up process. The Sufis, he suggested, traveled to the archipelago with trade guilds and lived with these guilds or corporations in their own quarter or archipelago port cities. And the Sufis were members of a very much sophisticated urban phenomenon. From this base, the Sufis began to associate themselves with royal courts, he said, even marrying the daughters of Indonesian, Malaysian, Malay nobility. They then proceeded to convert the monarchs. Now, there are problems with this particular bottom-up approach. The Dutch scholar, Van Bransen, has called it doubtful whether the foreign Muslim traders with Southeast Asia were ever organized in anything resembling guilds. He also says there's just no recorded mention of any of the Sufi orders until several centuries after the beginning of Islamization. When the Sufi orders did eventually become established, says Van Bransen, they seemed to find a following in court circles, and only at a much later stage did they filter down to the population at large. Van Bransen therefore focuses on rulers rather than merchant guilds, and this brings me back to research that I was involved in some years ago. I noted then that Russell Jones from the London School of Oriental and African Studies was one of the few scholars to highlight the role of local rulers in the Islamization of Southeast Asia. He did this partly by examining what he called conversion myths, which are written in Malay, Indonesian literary works. The evidence, such as it is, does suggest that Islamization did not involve conquest or the replacement of existing rulers by Islamic ones. In fact, in many cases, the existing pre-Islamic rulers appear to have been critical in advancing and defending the new faith. In the Malay annals, the 15th century Malaccan ruler, Sultan Muhammad Shah, is described as the first person in the polity to be converted. And then it is reported that he commanded all the people of Malacca, whether of high or low degree, to become Muslim. The early 16th century account of Malacca by the Portuguese Tommy Pires, which contains many stories from the Sultanate period of the previous century, says that the Malaccan Sultan instructed other rulers in the region in the things of Muhammad because he knew all about them. To take a few examples from other parts of the archipelago, in Pasai, in North Sumatra, a Malay text says that the ruler was sent all the regalia and panoply of royalty from Mecca and also engaged in religious discussion with Islamic scholars. The emphasis in this text, the Ikayat Raja Raja Pasai, so the historian Ken Hall notes, is not on a community of faithful Muslims, Ummah, governed by law, Sharia, but on a ruler-centered, ritually based community. Now, turning to Sulawesi, the Chronicle of Talo relates that the ruler of that state brought Islam to the people of Makassar. Some accounts of Ternate and the Malaccas suggest that its ruler was the first person in his kingdom to adopt Islam. I'll not give further example, but when we stand back and consider what is known about the pre-Islamic archipelago in Southeast Asia more generally, it is not surprising to find the rulers playing a critical role in the expansion of Islam. The centrality of monarchy is a long-term distinguishing feature of the socio-political structure of Southeast Asia. The influential French anthropologist Louis Dumont once remarked on the absence in the earlier Indianization of Southeast Asia of the caste system with its superior Brahmin caste. Dumont highlighted that in this process of Indianization, the local Southeast Asia ruler was not dispossessed of his religious prerogatives. In fact, said Dumont, the institution of monarchy could be said to have fixed a limit to Indian influence in Southeast Asia. So kingship has not only pre-Islamic, but also deep pre-Indian rules. The local title, Yang Perpetuan, is a reminder of the pre-Indian period. The role of monarchy in the Indian period is suggested also in the way the kingdom of Srivijaya is described in Arab texts as the empire of the Maharaja. Much later, the Malay annals portrayed the pre-Muslim founder of Malacca in Bodhisattva-like terms, as Oliver Walters observed. The ruler's headgear is said to contain 5 ornaments, and he materializes on a hill, Bukit Seguntang, near Palembang, and appears with golden rays emanating forth, something which is a familiar attribute of bodhisattvas. This bodhisattva figure in Buddhism, of course, is the seemingly enlightened being who postpones his own spiritual liberation in order to assist the religious progress of his people. Association with the bodhisattva highlights the fundamental religious significance of monarchy, and we see the bodhisattva concept employed in mainland Southeast Asia, as well as in the archipelago. Now, perhaps the best way to illustrate the centrality of the ruler in the Malay world is to consider the word Kerajaan, which sometimes defined as ruler or government or state in classic texts, but the closest definition is just the condition of having a Raja. People in a Malay polity were simply living in the condition of having a Raja. And Malay traditional literature makes clear that in the absence of a Raja, there is utter confusion, huru hara. I've written in some detail on the particular character of the Malay monarchical state, the Kerajaan. I won't elaborate now, but what I would say is that we know enough about the pivotal centrality of the ruler in the Kerajaan polity not to be surprised by the ruler's fundamental importance in the Islamization process. Furthermore, in identifying the ruler's fundamental importance, we find an analytical opportunity. We gain a vantage point, a human reference point for seeking some form of internal understanding of the propagation of Islam in Southeast Asia. For an historian influenced by the type of history writing that the philosopher R.G. Collingwood advocated, and the Southeast Asian historian Oliver Walters practiced, the quest to understand events in terms of the thinking of the historical actor, the experience of the person involved in Islamization, is uppermost. For an historian committed to this type of approach, much of the writing on Islamization, with its stress on economic patterns, network interactions, and so forth, is immensely valuable. It seems abstracted in not being rooted in the specific human experience of that period. By contrast, Merle Rickless, writing more in the Walters tradition, asked the right question in his study of Islam in Java. He wanted to know what any Javanese thought about the new faith, how they understood the meaning of Islam's message and its implications for them. Now, among other benefits, such an approach as this helps the study of the propagation of Islam to contribute to the history of ideas. An ideal starting point for considering the ruler's perspective on Islam, why he was willing to convert when he did and not earlier, is the narrative told to the Portuguese writer Tomé Pires. He was informed that in the case of the Malacca monarchy, mullahs, as he termed them, ulama, whom he said were chiefly Arabs, had come to the port with Moorish merchants before the ruler adopted Islam. The mullahs, Pires was told, tried to convince the ruler to turn Moor, to convert, and the ruler eventually came to like these mullahs. So the question we must ask is, why did he come to like them? What did he learn that made him opt for conversion? And of course, which would have made Malay rulers reluctant to embrace Islam? What would have made them reluctant to embrace Islam in earlier periods? The perspective a ruler possessed, we can probably assume, was concerned especially with leadership, particularly, we might say, with the special dignity and special powers that might be available to a leader. We get a hint of this in the way, soon after conversion, that the archipelago rulers adopted Muslim titles and epithets, Sultan, Shah, God's shadow on earth, and so forth. With respect to special powers, we know from pre-Islamic times that these rulers had an interest in supernatural techniques and capabilities. Thus, the ruler of Srivijaya and Sumatra in the 7th century inscription offered his subjects divine rewards and threatened them with supernatural sanctions. Malay texts dealing with the coming of Islam also stressed the ruler's interest in supernatural, magical feats, noting the rulers were impressed when they saw ulama or Sufis perform such feats. I'm thinking, for instance, of stories and chronicles from Pasai and Kutai in Borneo. Taking note of such royal concerns about enhancing or at least maintaining monarchical dignity and spiritual prowess gives us some sense of the likely perspective from which rulers assessed Islam. Another long-established royal perspective appears to have been the persistent search for trade. In court writings, the successful ruler tended to be someone who could attract large numbers of merchants. Also, Pierre-Yves Mongan pointed out long ago that the founding of such kingdoms as Baras in Sumatra, Cirebon in Java, or Kutai in Borneo is presented in texts as being linked to the arrival of trade from the wider world. To sum up then this point, the dignifying of rulership, the acquisition of magical powers, the accumulation of trade, these could seem to have been the priorities of the archipelago ruler. At least in the case of the first of these two priorities, I can see some reason why it was in the 13th century and not earlier that rulers could begin to be comfortable with and even attracted to Islam. Now, one of the strong points of Anthony Johns' writing on Sufism was that he focused attention not just on the archipelago, but also on the wider Muslim world. He said that the reason it was only in the 13th century that Islamization took place in Southeast Asia was that it was only then that Sufism took hold in Muslim societies more generally. In focusing as I am on the perspectives and experience of the ruler, a ruler who had engaged in dialogue with mullahs, as Tomei Pires called them, we need to think further about the way the Muslim world more generally would seem to have changed. Jean Gelman-Taylor has put the point well in her History of Indonesia. She suggests that the form of Islam that was eventually adopted in Southeast Asia was not the Islam of the 7th century Arabian desert. It appears to have been an egalitarianism, a lack of respect for social hierarchy in early Muslim society. It would have troubled a Southeast Asian ruler. A suspicion of worldly authority, for instance, is indicated in the statement from the Prophet Muhammad that whenever a man exceeds to authority, he drifts away from God. The historian S.D. Goitan has written on this topic, noting a 10th century Muslim thinker who condemned scholars who took part in the dealings of this world. Another early scholar said a religious man who goes to see a ruler loses his religion. Goitan suggested the spirit of freedom and even anarchy prevailing among the pre-Islamic Arab tribes was revived in Islam on religious grounds in the form of opposition to the established government. Now, if we can picture again the Malay rulers engaging in conversation with ulama, they might well have picked up something about the attitude that seems to have been prominent in the early Muslim world. It would not be surprising if the rulers felt the new religion had little to offer and was even something to be avoided. By the 13th century, however, changes were underway in that wider Muslim world that from a ruler's point of view made the adoption of Islam a far less negative and even attractive prospect. Two developments in the Muslim world seem of special importance. Now, I'm not a specialist on global Islamic history, but the scholarly literature does provide helpful information on these developments. The first development in Muslim societies generally was concerned with the status of kingship. Persian perspectives on monarchy appear to have become influential. The caliphate itself began to assume a more imperial character, and in addition, a wide range of other monarchies emerged. In the 11th century, the Seljuk rulers took a new title, Sultan, and were then called Shadow of God on Earth. They have been described as adopting Persian ideas of monarchy. In India, the Delhi Sultans were also called Shadow of God on Earth. And the relatively less important rulers of Bengal took the Persian title Shah. By the time the Malaccan rulers were being influenced in dialogue with the ulama, the Muslim world was becoming characterized by an expanding galaxy of monarchies, an expanding galaxy of monarchies. It might well have been tempting and certainly not disadvantageous for a Malay ruler to see himself joining that galaxy. Rather than being confronted by a dangerous egalitarianism, which might insist on human equality before God, the hierarchies of Muslim states could be seen to have much in common with existing Malay monarchy, influenced by Indian concepts, including that of the Bodhisattva. The Indonesian scholar Jajat Burhanuddin has suggested that Islam may have provided actually a religious justification for the rise of absolutist kingdoms of the archipelagos. Now, this may be an exaggeration. The rulers had long possessed Hindu-Buddhist legitimation. What does need stressing is that the new religion would no longer have seemed to be an impediment to Malay royal aspirations. On the other hand, adopting Islamic terminology in place of Hindu-Buddhist concepts may have helped the ruler to strengthen relations with a growing number of foreign Muslims, including Muslim merchants in his polity. Noted already that the historical record suggests a growing number of Muslim foreigners and visitors about the time Islam began to be adopted in the archipelago. Noted too the emergence of a range of smaller states, seemingly competing with one another for trade, and recall as well that the attracting of trade is declared time and again in Malay writings to be a priority for a ruler. At the very least, the adoption of Islam would allow the Malay ruler to describe his authority in terms that Muslims coming to his country would understand and respect. That's the first development. A second development, the Persianization of kingship, the first development. A second development in the wider Muslim world is also likely to have interested Malay rulers engaging. Development concerns doctrines in Sufism. Here I note the view of Brunson that Sufism was not a bottom-up influence in Malay society, moving from the trader community up to the royal courts, but was in fact associated in the first instance with the royal courts themselves. The particular doctrine is likely to have attracted Malay rulers was that of the perfect man, the Sufi concept of a saintly figure who is said to have realized his essential oneness with the divine being. In the manner of the Buddhist Bodhisattva, he is portrayed as assuming responsibility for the spiritual progress of his followers. The perfect man is also part of the Sufi knowledge that offers access to supernatural or magical skills. Now, I've noted already the way Malay writings highlight the ruler's interest in such skills. In one well-known tale concerning Malacca, a ruler seemed to believe that this Sufi knowledge gave him the power of invulnerability. The influence of the perfect man concept is not, the evidence rather for the influence of the perfect man concept is not abundant, but Malay court writings, including from Malacca, suggest the rulers or the ulama with whom they spoke were acquainted with the writings of the 15th century mystic Al-Jili and his 13th century predecessor Ibn al-Arabi, both of whom were responsible for the development of the perfect man concept. And among other evidence, Nagib Alatas has quoted a poem that describes a 16th century ruler of Aceh in language associated with the perfect man, about this perfect man concept in the past. But we'd make three quick observations here. First, there is evidence of one type or another to suggest that it was influential in numerous centers in the archipelago. Secondly, the perfect man was not merely a concern of people on the periphery of the Muslim world, but the population in the archipelago. There's evidence of the presence of perfect man idea in India and elsewhere in the Muslim world. My third point draws upon a further comment made by Van Bruggen. Given the supernatural benefits to be gained from the perfect man concept and other Sufi thinking, it's not surprising that Sufism was initially an elite project and not a bottom-up project. Well, assuming the rulers saw Sufism as a source of spiritual power, at once legitimizing and supporting their position, says Van Bruggen, that to quote him, it would not have been in the ruler's interest to make the same spiritual power available to their subjects. Now, what I'm not certain of is just how far these trends in the Muslim world, one Persian notion of kingship and the other Sufi perfect man notion, how far these trends with regard to monarchy and Sufism offered new benefits to rulers. At the very least, these developments would have made the Muslim world appear a more congenial place for a Malay ruler, certainly more comfortable than it would have appeared to be in earlier centuries. In highlighting these trends, therefore, we're helping to explain the timing of Islamization. In this respect, let me also draw reference to the work on South Sulawesi of Christian Pelras. Now, this work on Islamization also draws on the history of ideas. He noted that the South Sulawesi people had been exposed to Islam for 125 years before accepting the new religion. Focused on why Islam was resisted, again examining the perspective of the rulers. The rulers, he argued, resisted Islam because they feared it would jeopardize social order and threaten their power. The pre-Muslim rulers there had highlighted the myth concerning the divine descent of the local nobility, and such a myth contradicted the Islamic stress on the uniqueness of God and the equality of all men beneath God. Now, Pelras then shows how eventually, working on ideas, certain local Sulawesi writings, influenced in part by the Malay text Chaja Salatin, sought to replace the pagan basis on which aristocratic power had rested, especially the myth of the hierarchy descent of the rulers, and turned to the medieval Persianized view of monarchy as the representative of Allah on earth. Here, in this Sulawesi case, as in the Malacca and other West Archipelago cases that I've been discussing, we see the role of ideas. Ideas at one point acting to prevent Islamization, and another being developed in such a way as to aid the process within. In this discussion so far, therefore, I've been viewing Islamization from the standpoint of the rulers, asking what the process might have meant to them, why they acted when they did. I've adopted this monarch standpoint not as a random choice, but because the evidence suggests the rulers really were critical in Islamization. The propagating of the new religion in the narrative I've been developing was a top-down, not a bottom-up development of the type suggested in some accounts of the role of Sufism. Secondly, the history of ideas approach, which I favor, helps to highlight the role of local agency in advancing Islamization. In his pioneering work, John saw the Sufis as the active element in Islamization. In the account I've been presenting today, I'm stressing local agency. That is the role of the Malay rulers in engaging in dialogue with ulama, weighing up what they were being told about Islamic doctrines, and then taking into account long-held Malay royal priorities, deciding to convert. I've not time today to trace in any detail the way the rulers then proceeded to mold the states as Islamic polities. to mold them as part of the continuing Kerajaan Islamization. Numerous other scholars have focused on this topic, and I would certainly mention the Indonesian historian Jajat Burhanuddin, the Singapore-based scholar Syed Khairuddin Al-Junaid. This said, there has been some debate about how quickly the coming of Islam brought change in Southeast Asia. Some have written of a cultural revolution and a profound disruption of the social order. It'll be evident from what I've said already that I favour, as I think Khairuddin Al-Junaid does, I favour a different point of view. That in the first centuries of Islamization, there was only gradual change. We see this gradualism in the way early mosques drew upon pre-Islamic architecture, in the design of gravestones, the location of holy sites, and the juxtaposing of royal titles. For instance, in a 14th century gravestone calling the ruler of Brunei both a sultan and a maharaja. When the Malacca Muslim leadership introduced a set of laws at the time that the code displayed serious Islamic influence, but the laws are stated to have been laid down by the Sultan, and it's warned that anyone who disobeys the laws is, I quote, guilty of treason against his majesty. This conveys the impression that this early set of laws gains authority not from religion, but from the ruler. The specific laws themselves offer choices of punishment, Islamic punishment or local custom. In the case of theft, there is a choice between amputation and fining. Kashnor Johan has suggested the existence of choice indicates tension between a pro-custom and a pro-Islamic camp in the Malacca Sultanate. Another explanation, I suppose, could be that the Islamic elements are included specifically for foreign merchants at the port. The famous 14th century inscription found in Terengganu also includes both custom and Islamic law. In particular, it seems to be implementing a system of punishment determined according to rank. A system which would run against Islamic principles. The Malaysian scholar Ahmad Adam has drawn attention as well to Pali and Sanskrit terms in the inscription, which indicates, he says, that culturally, Terengganu was still attached to Hindu-Buddhist religious concepts. Jajat Burhanuddin has discussed the continuing Kerajaan influence some centuries later in Tajus Salatin, the early 17th century text aimed at explaining the workings of a Muslim kingdom. This text spells out the religious duties of rulers and also shows signs of Sufi influence. It certainly carries the long-established Malay injunction against treason or durhaka. Even when a ruler does not himself obey the commands of God and the traditions of the Prophet, the text says it's important to obey his words because of the need to avoid disorder. Just as in the Malay annals, loyalty and obedience to the ruler is presented as a principle standing higher than all other precepts. Well, the way in which the incoming religion accommodated local beliefs such as that, and local institutions, would not be seen to suggest some deep corruption of Islam. It does not suggest some deep corruption of Islam in Kerajaan Muslim polities in the Malay world. It's interesting that visitors to the archipelago, such as the Moroccan Ibn Battuta in the 14th century and the Chinese Muslim Ma Huan in the 15th century, didn't condemn the way the religion was practiced in the Malay Kerajaan polities. And again, we need to see the Malay communities in the context of the wider Muslim world of that time, a galaxy of monarchies with the influence of Sufism in every direction. In many parts of India and West Asia, just as in the Malay states, one would encounter the mixing of Islamic and local thinking. It was a world, according to the historian of Islam, Marshall Hodgson, which possessed a generous intellectual spirit, tolerating wide differences of opinion and behavior. There were always Sharia-minded ulama who tried to place limits on this flexibility. But these Sharia-minded, to use Hodgson's phrase, Marshall Hodgson's phrase, these religious scholars for whom the implementation of God's law was the highest objective, only really gained traction in the 17th century. At that stage, the Malay rulers began to face the challenge of a widespread Sharia-minded reformist movement, which, in the words of the late Azumari Azra, sought the socio-moral reconstruction of Muslim societies. Azumari traced the growing influence of this movement in Southeast Asia, and of course, it continues to grow today. To sum up then, by the time the Malay rulers began to embrace Islam, back in the 13th century, the preoccupations of the Muslim world would not have seemed antagonistic toward Malay political and social values and institutions. The rulers would not have seen themselves facing a radical or subversive challenge in the process of Islamization. This is consistent with the evidence that the Islamizing that preceded was a gradual process, able to accommodate earlier Malay thinking and behavior. By contrast, over the last 3 centuries, the wider Muslim world changed again, bringing added religious and social claims into Malay life. Where monarchies continue today to thrive, as they do in Malaysia, in Brunei, Morocco, or in the Middle East, the dialogue between monarch and ulama is having to take account of this changing religious climate. Stop.
Thank you very much, Tony, for this fascinating reflection about Islamization process. I think it seems to be a response towards some form of so-called decolonial revisionist of history of Islam region. So I think it is a very interesting counterpoint. I note that you stressed that it was a top-down project with local agency, meaning that the sultans were trying to respond to changing social context, but again in consideration of their position. And I think it corresponds with what we had studied before, that the Islam being practiced in this region had been sort of very flexible syncretic Islam rather than very fast sort of Sharia and so-called hudud type of implementation. Perhaps before opening up the questions, to give you time to think about questions, perhaps it makes me think of, what do you think about what William Roth said, that the Malay rulers at that time did not have sufficient bureaucratic power before the coming of the British, sufficient bureaucratic power to sort of enforce a very sort of strict type of Islamic rule. And actually he was saying that Islam was more sort of practiced in the context of the villages and kampongs, whereby there are religious leaders whom they look up to for their religious activities and practices. And
I respond to you. Yeah.
one more question.
I think he's probably right. During the colonial period, which I'm clearly not talking about, but during the colonial period, the rulers made use of bureaucratic developments, I suppose, and bureaucratic techniques, and the British had accepted the rulers had a special role with Islam, and in some ways helped to reinforce the rulers' control over the religion of society. But it's hard to judge, because it's important that we're not, in the period I'm talking about, it's rulers remained central as they were. They clearly were dynamic in the Islamization process. I suppose it was useful when there was a building up of a Sharia-minded critique of monarchy, that the British gave the rulers an opportunity to develop bureaucratic techniques for controlling that. And there's a real story about how that worked. And I think the rulers are quite shrewd, actually, in the way they've handled this, sometimes by co-opting very serious Sharia-minded ulama, engaging them and bringing them into the royal circles, others by censoring material and so forth. It would be a mistake to see them as somehow naive in this. I think rather skillful, probably.
Okay, yeah. I do not know whether there are any listeners who want to pose some questions to Prof. Milner.
Yep.
Yeah, if not, just another thought about you know that at the beginning of 20th century there was this tension between kaum muda and kaum tua, and kaum tua is more associated with the traditional religious authorities, which is opted by the British, so forth, and kaum muda took the inspiration from developments in Middle East, and they were also critiquing the religious authorities and so on. How do you see this trend sort of land in your own?
I mentioned Azumadi Azra, who has just died actually, and of COVID, and was a splendid scholar, Indonesian rector of the Islamic University. But he, I think his analysis is closer to it. That I think the important thing was the people of both kaum muda and kaum tua, when they stress Sharia mindedness, I think that is the challenge. I'm not sure I fully agree with the rough emphasis on that division rather than the emphasis on, I mean, there are people in Malay society who were working hard, and you know well, on the creation of Bangsa Melayu, of a sense of Malay ethnicity and Malay nationalism. And against that, there were people who saw modernity as a great strengthening of a sense of Islamic identity, membership of the Islamic community of the Ummah. And involved in that was a sense that the leaders of that community would be the people most knowledgeable in religion, the ulama. That's a really important division, I think. It's not that the Bangsa Melayu people were not Muslim. They were Muslim, but they couched it in Malay national terms. And the others sort of transcended Malay nationality and looked for something universally Muslim. I thought that was a very important tension, and one that's continued to be quite important, and probably in recent developments in the election. So I'm not sure about, if you ask about kaum muda, kaum tua, I'm not sure that that's the key division. I think this other one is the one that matters most. But the Roth book's a wonderful book on this. Of course, Roth's book is structured in terms of an understanding of the building up of Malay nationalism. So he tends to emphasize everything that flows into Malay unity, because that's the time he wrote the book. If you look at the situation 20 years later, Malay unity is not so obvious. What's interesting is how Malay society is divided, not how it's unified.
Actually, in his book, he did talk about this unity. There was a division between, they couldn't come to an agreement even about who is a Malay, in the sense that at the state level, when they tried to regulate membership, they rejected those, who were not born in states and so forth.
Yeah, but he's telling the story of how they slowly overcome that. But there's a lot of resistance among the sultans to Malay associations initially. They wanted the associations to be state-based, sultanate-based, not Malay national. But that's clearly another huge topic. You're right in what you said earlier, that what I'm trying to emphasize in talking today is this, so it is about ideas. I don't think there's been enough attention given to the role of ideas and to debate of ideas in Malay society. And in the study of the coming of Islam, there's a lot of talk about different, I've been looking at them recently, different networks, different connections flowing here, flowing there. It's not grounded in a struggle of ideas. And so that's why I'm trying to find a vantage point from which to talk about the history of ideas in Islamization. That's why I've taken the Raja as the vantage point and seeing what Islam might have meant at different stages to the Raja. And that allows us to try to come to a decision as to why it was in the 1300s rather than earlier that you have Islamization of the Malay states. And along with that, I'm trying to press the fact that this is not the active principle, is not the external one, but is a mixture. I mean, there is local agency in all of this. There's too much work, as you know. I've just been reading a review that Kwa Chong Wan put me onto of recent work coming out on the Indianization period in Southeast Asia, and work that's really bringing home how creative the Southeast Asians were, how much it's been a mistake to see the spread of Indian culture across Southeast Asia as basically geared by Indians coming from the subcontinent and spreading their ideas, when in fact you have enormous creativity at this end. And in terms of temples and sculpture and whatever, lots of indication of local initiative. I'm just saying the same sort of thing with Islam, that there is a local element, there's a local force, a local agency in creating these Muslim states. Clearly, by the time we get to the 17th, 18th century, there's a tension between that local and the broader Muslim worldviews, which are more Sharia-minded, reformist views. But that was not the case initially. And people were not coming here and visiting and saying how terrible Islam was in this area. It was not properly practiced. I think it was very quickly part of a broader Muslim world, as I called it, a sort of galaxy of monarchies. I think it's important for us to see that and to take seriously the role of ideas in making Islamization possible and in resisting Islamization earlier.
Yeah. It seems to me that it ties in with your book about the invention of politics, because you were talking three different type of idea of community, right? Which is in tension with each other. People are trying to mobilize the Malay community in terms of Kerajaan idea and umat, and also
that's true. A part of that book. The book tried to look at three groups in Malay society: the people building up a sense of Malay unity, Bangsa Malaya, if you like, Bangsa being the key. Second group, emphasizing a widespread global, really, Islamic movement, emphasizing membership of the Ummah rather than the just a local Malay Bangsa. And the third group, I was going to say defending, but not merely defending, but the group that was continuing to put the point of view of the Rajas and to put it in some ways very imaginatively and respond in a sense to both the Islamic and the Bangsa Malayu criticisms by incorporating them in a way in the role of the monarchy. So in each of these cases, there's a dynamic ideological work going on, and I was interested in that. I mean, that book was very much about a debate of ideas, and clearly the Islamic element in that book, the background of that element is what I'm talking about now, really. or toward the
Any,
end. Yeah.
sorry, any question from among the participants?
This is excellent. It must have been very convincing.
Well, Professor Anthony, could I pose the question? I think Abdul Rahman put up his hand first. I think Abdul Rahman, he should be asked first. Yeah.
All right, please.
Okay. Thank you, the chairperson. Thank you, Prof, for giving this kind of enlightening talk on the issue of Islamization in South Asia. My question is, I would like to pose to you is that can we use legal text, the Malay legal text, classical Malay text, to measure the degree of Sharia mindedness in terms of Islam in Southeast Asia or in the Malay world? Thank you.
Well,
Should we take both questions first, or you want to answer one by one?
yeah, that's a good question. That the Undang-Undang Malacca is a really interesting text, and a colleague of mine was doing an edition of it when we were together in England once. So I ended up looking at it quite carefully because of his work, my reading of it probably is a bit different from others, but it's certainly got Islamic elements in it, elements of clear Islamic law in it, but it is striking that it gives alternatives. As I gave the example, for instance, you could have fines or amputation for theft. You can choose your alternative. The record suggests, from what Westerners wrote, that it was generally, I think in this period, not the Islamic alternative that was chosen, but the local custom. And I couldn't help wondering whether the text was including this because it was a text partly for the Muslim traders in the port who might well want to be governed by Islamic principles rather than local principles. But also the way in which the text presented is interesting. So on the one hand, it does have strong Islamic elements in it, but its overall presentation is worth reading, its introduction to the text. And it does couch it in terms of royal authority. Royal authority. I've forgotten the phrase, but I've forgotten the Malay word for it, but the text, the laws are passed down by a ruler. There's that concept of it's flowing from a ruler. And instead of being explicitly flowing from Islamic doctrine, they're flowing from a ruler. And in fact, if you don't do the right thing, you contravene the commands of the ruler and you suffer the punishment from the ruler and so forth. So it is clearly a royal text, I think, as well as having the Islamic elements in them. So I think the text is probably a good way to see that mixture of the local and Islamic, that creative mixture. In time, of course, that balance has to change, and it's changing all the time. But nevertheless, there you have what Irudin uses, partly because of what I'm saying now, I suppose, but he talks about Kerajaan Islam. Well, yeah, I mean, it's not just Malay. You get a combination of the Islamic and the local all over the Islamic world. That was the combination here. So I think it's interesting. I think it's quite creative, and we should deal with it sympathetically as part of his history of ideas. I'm struck by this review I've just been given in the last couple of days about work being done on Indianization, which is quite dramatic, actually, bringing out the importance of Southeast Asian scholarship to see the local creativity, the local agency. So I'm picking up a bit on that here. I suppose I wrote this beforehand, but it fits with that argument.
Okay, Philip. Yeah.
Hi, thank you, Professor Milner, for a very interesting tapestry of the history of ideas in Islamization, which is, for someone like me who's a novice in this area, it's fascinating. But just more an observation, and whether it elicit any meaningful comment from you is okay. You mentioned the word Indianization, and therefore there is a Hindu kind of influence in the Southeast Asia area, but the mixture of Islam with the mercantile trade coming into Southeast Asia appears to have such a powerful impulse. And you did use the word in modernity. I guess trade and marketplace and all these are part of elements of modernity. How do you see, in what way was there strong missions or mythological commitment by this mercantile class traders who bring with them a train of ulamas maybe, which therefore had that impact on rulers? And why is it that the Hindu or Indianization, if I understand the phrase properly, could not resist this transformative power of this monotheistic, mission-minded group? And then, of course, to complicate matters, you have the colonial Christian mythological groups. When these clash, maybe your comment about that creative way which the Raja may navigate on all this may actually be a very fruitful area for observation. That's my comment is more in the nature of a very broad observation, nothing that really poses a direct question. Thank you.
I suppose if I pick up on that, it has been, particularly with Dutch scholars, a real stress on trade as the key. I'm just somehow I'm not satisfied particularly with that. It's sort of, you say trade and Islam follows, boom. How? And that's why Wycliffe's is interesting. I mean, Wycliffe asks the right questions. What does it mean to people? It's not that you have trade and become Muslim. What's going on there? And there was trade much earlier. So why didn't Islam establish itself at the same time as Hindu Buddhist ideas were still settling in the region? There were plenty of Muslim merchants around, it seems, back in the sort of 10th, 11th century and whatever, and earlier. So why? Why did it not catch on the way Hindu Buddhist ideas did? And I suppose saying we've got to get and look at the ideas, we've got to get in. You can't get inside people's minds, but there's got to be some attempt to understand things from their point of view, as Walter's, Wycliffe's, go back along that line of analysis, people like Robin Collingwood would argue. So you attempt to understand things in terms of the historical actor. Well, in that case, it's not enough just to mention the trade. I mean, why didn't they take Islam earlier? And so I'm working on that. I think it's because the Islam they faced in those earlier centuries would be by no means as appealing. Whereas ideas in Buddhism, for instance, this idea of the Bodhisattva is very interesting. You see it in Burma, you see it in inscriptions from the kings of Burma, like Wolong Situ in the 13th, 12th century. His description of his role as king, crossing the river of samsara, helping the drowning over, presenting himself as having a religious role for his subjects, somebody who reaches out and helps his people to achieve spiritual liberation, whatever. I mean, those are the words. They're in the inscriptions. That's the way they spoke to their people. They had a religious role for themselves. And I think Walters is right. When you look at the Sejarah Melayu, you see signs that the pre-Islamic ruler in the Malay world was very similar. Presented himself in a religious way. And one can guess that might well have been how rulership was viewed way back earlier. Just as that anthropologist Dumont said, it was so strong that one thing that didn't stick in Southeast Asia in the Indian period was caste. The Brahmins never became the superior element of Southeast Asia the way they were in India, because kingship was so central. So the kings would have found the Bodhisattva ideal appealing and took those ideas from Buddhism. They wouldn't have found early Islam appealing. The doctrines there would have had little to offer monarchs. So it seems to me we need to know the content of those ideas. We need to think in terms of what it meant to the people converting, whether we're talking about Indianization or Islamization, in order to get some answer as to why the timing was as it is, and why, and what it meant, and what it actually meant to people. So I'm not sure I've answered your question, Philip, but I'm moving around religion and trade, whatever. The trade's important because it brought people there. But how come it brought people who weren't listened to for a long time and then they were?
Well, maybe a very short comment. I was thinking, when I was in Kashmir, I saw a narrative of history going back to Adam and tracing it right down how the descendants of Adam came down towards the South Asia region. I'm not talking about South Asia now, the South Asia region in Kashmir. That intrigued me because a kind of a historicist, if may I use that word, narrative provided a kind of a link to identity, using your word that you threw up, that welds this amalgam of trade, of a certain sense of how do I hang my power now, my sovereign power, where do I derive my sovereign power? And if you throw in a bit of theology just as a conjecture, then the Sultan or the Shah, the shadow of Allah, as they say, is the vice regent, all right, of the Ummah. Then this whole concept of the covenant people of Islam, my own humble view, the word Ummah comes also from the covenant sense of Second Temple Judaism, but these are all a longer conversation. But this sense of welding of identity in the wake of trade that brought modernity and market society, and then the historical narrative that allows the Sultan or the ruler and the people that he ruled over to have that identity, right? Perhaps that could be an impulse. I mean, again, I'm just purely conjecturing and responding to your very interesting lecture. Thank you for being patient to my conjecture.
Your comments are very much along the line, including the other example you give of what I'm trying to get at. These things are tricky, as you're indicating. But this seems to me to be the right way for us to go as historians, to ask these questions and to try and make sense of it. Yeah. Whether we're dealing with the Islamic world or elsewhere.
Sure.
Identity is a strong word these days. We're hearing a lot about identity. I wonder what the driver, even in what I've been saying about Islam, I get worryingly close to seeing the rulers as concerned about grabbing as much trade as they can, grabbing as many magical powers as they can, and grabbing a high title for themselves. I mean, it worries me that all of that sounds pretty political. I'm just thinking about it now. We have to come to terms with the fact that sometimes there's a spiritual, religious impulse, not a political one. And I think I must be careful in what I'm writing about this, not to make it look as though in the end it's all fundamentally political. Because I think sometimes the implications could be political in terms of our modern analysis, but the actual driving force may not be. I mean, what leads a ruler of Burma or a ruler of the Malay state to reach out to Islam? Is it just cold calculation, or to what extent is it bringing new meaning to their lives? Interesting stuff.
I'm thinking of a work of David Priestley, right, on kings, priests, sages, and the mercantile class in from your History of Ideas conversation. And that book, I think, with a kind of Weberian emphasis, is fascinating as to which groups control, which elite get, co-opted, if you use the word non-pejoratively, into using these forms to exercise the control over the polity. Do you think that is an intriguing way of looking at it too? Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. David Priestley, is it? I don't know that. That's it. Priestley? Interesting. Interesting. Thank you.
Okay. I do not know, unless there is one last burning question, we will end this very rich session. Any hands? 3, 2, 1, gone. So I think, yeah, you have given us a very rich food for thought for the weekend. We hope to see, you know, you putting in writing some of your thoughts, and yeah, and we can benefit from, yeah, studies.
Thank you, Helen, very much.
Thank you very much for sharing. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Anthony.
Sorry, Anthony. Priestland, David Priestland. Priestland, yeah.
Priestland, got it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Tony. Goodbye.
Bye.